In today's short documentary, we'll be going over the Russian Railroad. I do not have very much footage on railroads, so I'll be using a black screen throughout the video so you can relax, enjoy, and before the locomotive changed Russia forever, life across the empire was shaped by one powerful force: distance. Russia is one of the largest countries on Earth, stretching across thousands of miles of forest, mountains, plains, and frozen landscapes. From the west to the vast Siberian wilderness in the east, communities were separated by enormous distances that made travel and trade extremely difficult. For people living in Russia before the age of railroads, transportation depended on the environment around them. Rivers became one of the most important routes for moving people and goods during warmer months. In the winter, frozen waterways could become temporary roads allowing sleds and horse-drawn vehicles to cross areas that were otherwise difficult to reach. But these methods were slow and unpredictable and heavily controlled by the seasons. The Russian climate created some of the greatest challenges. When long winters brought freezing temperatures, heavy snow, and dangerous travel conditions. In many regions, roads could become nearly impossible to use, cutting off communities from nearby towns and markets. A journey that might take days under good conditions can become weeks or impossible during harsh weathers. For the many different peoples and tribes living across Russia's enormous territory, geography shaped their entire way of life. Some groups adapted to the forest, relying on hunting, fishing, and gathering resources from the land. Others lived across the open plains, where livestock and seasonal movement were essential to their survival. In Siberia and the far north, indigenous communities developed ways of life that adapted to the extreme cold, and by using knowledge that's passed down through generations to survive in some of the harshest environments on Earth. Even Russia's resources were affected by some of these challenges. The empire had enormous supplies of timber, minerals, coal, and other valuable materials. But getting these resources from remote regions to growing cities was a major problem. A country with such potential was limited by the ability to connect itself. Before railroads, distance was more than just a measurement, it was an obstacle. Some of the vast landscapes made Russia powerful, but also made it difficult to unite. The arrival of the locomotive promised to change that by creating something Russia never truly had before, a way to connect its people, resources, and cities across an entire continent. Deep in Russia's Kaluga Oblast lies the city of Ludanovo. Today, roughly 35,000 people live here. To someone passing through, it might appear to be an ordinary Russian provincial city. But Ludanovo has a history that is deeply connected to something much larger than itself, the Russian railway industry. Long before diesel locomotives and electric trains became standard, Ludanovo was already an industrial center. Its industrial history reaches back to the 18th century when iron production was established in the area. As Russia's railway network expanded during the 19th century, Ludanovo's factories became increasingly involved in locomotive production. To understand why the rise and eventual decline of the locomotive industry in this specific Russian city mattered so much, we first have to understand the city itself. It is located in the Kaluga Oblast in western Russia, roughly halfway between Moscow and the Ukrainian border. Today, it's relatively a small industrial city. This did not begin as an industrial or locomotive city. It began with something much older: iron. In the 18th century, this region offered something extremely valuable to the Russian industrialists. The forests were for charcoal, deposits of iron ore, clay, sand, waterways, and land suitable for building dams and the industrial works. In 1732, industrialist Demidov investigated the area as a potential location for ironworks. By 1745, the first blast furnace in the city was operating. Iron was being smelted from locally sourced ore, using charcoal produced from the surrounding forests, and slowly something began to develop around this works. What was once a small settlement was becoming an industrial community, but iron production was only the beginning. During the 19th century, the Mostel family became instrumental in developing the locomotive factory. The factory began moving beyond basic iron production and into increasingly sophisticated forms of engineering. Rails were produced. In 1841, the works manufactured rails for the Nikolaev Railway, one of the most important railways in the Russian Empire, connecting Moscow and St. Petersburg. This was a major turning point. Russia was beginning to enter the railway age. It was producing in the infrastructure that allowed It was producing the infrastructure that allowed the railway age to happen. The factory also began producing machinery and steam-powered equipment. Then something more ambitious came. In the 1850s, it became involved in shipbuilding. Steam-powered vessels were constructed there, including vessels intended for Russia's rivers and waterways. The factory was becoming less like a traditional ironworks and more like a massive 19th century engineering complex. And then in the 1960s, other technological breakthroughs arrived. In 1866 and 67, the works installed two open hearth or Martin furnaces. These furnaces allowed the plant to produce significant quantities of steel that mattered enormously. Because steel was exactly what an expanding railway industry needed, rails required it, boilers required it, locomotives also required it. And now the small city had the ability to manufacture increasingly complicated machines from materials that it was already producing. The railway was coming to Russia at an incredible speed. But there was a problem. Much of the equipment used on Russia's early railways was imported from abroad. Russian industrialists wanted to change that. The Mostel works became one of the places where Russia attempted to build its own railway machinery. In 1868, the works received an order for 50 locomotives. The factory quickly acquired the equipment from older locomotive works in England and then transported to the city. Within a remarkably short time, the factory was ready to begin locomotive production. Then, 1870, something happened that permanently changed the identity of the city. The factory produced its first Russian narrow-gauge freight steam locomotive. The machine was small compared to enormous locomotives that would later come, but its importance was enormous. The city had entered its locomotive age, and it didn't stop with one locomotive. In 1871, the factory produced 19 locomotives. The following year, it produced 30 more for the Southern Railways. Government orders followed. In 1874, another order was placed for 150 locomotives. And these factories weren't only producing locomotives, they were producing rail vehicles. And between 1870 and 1871, these two railways produced the combination total of 373 locomotives and 114. Okay. Between 1870 and 1881, the Odessa Works produced a combined total of 373 locomotives, 145 passenger cars, and more than 8,400 freight cars. This was no longer simply a settlement surrounding an ironworks. It became an industrial center. The factory began its own and there was another remarkable development. The factory began building its own narrow gauge railway. In 1877, construction began on one line connecting the city with other wider industrial networks. The locomotives and rolling stock was for this railway or for themselves. The factory even produced a distinctive small type of four-wheeled locomotive for the line. It was building its own industrial world. Iron came from the ground, coal and charcoal provided the fuel. Furnaces transformed raw materials into iron and steel. Factories turned that metal into machinery. Locomotives and railway cars carried products away. For a time it seemed almost unstoppable. But there was also hidden problems inside the city's success. The city had become heavily dependent on this industry, and the industry itself was dependent on something it couldn't control: demand. As Russia's railway construction boom began to change in the late 19th century, competition increased and orders for the locomotives fell. The same railway revolution that helped transform the city could eventually threaten the very industry had grown on. This would not be the last time. Over the next century and a half, the city would experience the rise of steam, arrival of diesel, 2 world wars, a revolution, the Soviet industrial system, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and enormous changes in the railway industry. But for a time, the railway changed Ludenivo, and it had to change with it. Because by then the city became something much larger than a factory town. It became a city whose identity was built on iron. A locomotive is often remembered for the power of its engine, the sound of its whistle, or the miles of track it can travel. But behind every locomotive is something more important: the people who built it. Long before this town in Russia was known as the center of railway production, it was a town shaped by industry. Its story didn't begin with the locomotive rolling out of the factory door. It began with the people who learned how to work with iron, metal, machinery, and skills that would eventually transform this small Russian settlement into a much more important industrial center. During the 19th century, Russia was beginning to change. The empire had enormous natural resources, but turning those resources into finished products required factories, skilled workers, and communities built around manufacturing. Places like Ludenovo became examples of how industrialization could shape everyday life. As factories expanded, the demand for workers grew. People who once depended mainly on agricultural or traditional trades began moving toward industrial employment. Blacksmiths, mechanics, metalworkers, and other craftsmen became essential parts of this new industrial world. Their knowledge of working with materials, repairing equipment, and building complex machinery became the skills that Russia increasingly needed. The factory was more than just a place where people worked. It became the center of community. A growing industrial town needed more workshops and furnaces. It needed homes for workers and their families, stores to provide supplies, roads to move materials, and services to support a growing population. As more people arrived, Ludenovo began changing from a small settlement into a community built around manufacturing. For many families, the factory became a part of their identity. Skills were passed from one generation to the next. A father who worked with metal might teach his son the same trade. A young worker could begin as an apprentice, eventually becoming an experienced craftsman. Over time, the factory was not just simply an employer. It became the foundation of everyday life. Factory work in the 19th century was also a demanding and often dangerous place to work in. Workers spent long hours around heavy machinery, hot furnaces, and difficult conditions. Mistakes all could result in serious injuries, and the work required physical strength, focus, and experience. The same factories created opportunities, also placed enormous demands on the people who powered them. Despite these challenges, industrial towns like Locomotive represented something new for Russia. They became the shift from an economy based mostly on agriculture towards one that built around manufacturing, engineering, and technology. This transformation was important as Russia entered the age of railroads. A railway network stretching across such massive empire required more than just tracks, stations. It needed factories capable of producing equipment, workers who understood complex machinery, and communities prepared to support a new industrial age. And Locomotive was that story that was just beginning. There's a temptation, when looking at history of the locomotive, to imagine the railway spreading across the world simultaneously, as though the arrival of the steam locomotive in one country immediately set off a worldwide race to build tracks, stations, bridges, and engines. In reality, the story was much slower, much more uneven. In the case of Russia, surprisingly complicated. The Russian Empire would eventually become home to one of the largest railway systems on Earth. Produce large locomotives capable of hauling hundreds or even thousands of tons, and construct the Trans-Siberian Railway, one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Yet Russia's railway revolution began cautiously, hesitantly, and considerably later than the railway revolution taking place in Britain. When Britain began experimenting with practical public railways in the 1820s, Russia was still predominantly an arrogant empire whose enormous territory presented challenges that European countries with smaller, more densely populated regions did not face. The first public railway in Russia didn't open until 1837, more than a decade after the Stockton and Darlington Railway opened in Britain. Even then, the first Russian railway was only a short line, connecting St. Petersburg with the imperial residence of at Silo, and nearby the town of Pulis have loved. It was impressive as technological curiosity, but it was not yet the beginning of a nationwide railway network. In fact, until 1851, it remained only a public railway in Russia. The contrast becomes even more striking when we look at the railways that were already doing elsewhere. Britain had moved rapidly from experimental railway technology towards an expanding commercial network. Railways were connecting industrial towns, transporting coal, and manufactured goods. carrying passengers and transforming the geography of commerce. In the United States, railways were beginning to stretch beyond individual cities and towards an enormous continental network. Across parts of Western Europe, governments and private companies were also beginning to recognize that railways could fundamentally alter the movement of people, armies, raw materials, and information. Russia, meanwhile, had the technology and the engineers and the resources to participate in this transformation. But the country did not immediately embrace the railway with the same urgency, and that hesitation would matter. Because Russia was not simply another European country waiting to build a railway system, it had an enormous empire stretching across Eastern Europe and deep into Asia. A railway network in Russia would have to cross vast distances, enormous forests, wide rivers, mountains, swamps, frozen ground, and sparsely populated territory. The problem was not merely building a locomotive. The problem was determining where the railroad should go, who should pay for it, who should operate it, and what purpose it would serve, and whether an enormous investment could ever be recovered. For decades, those questions slowed Russian railway development. But once Russian government decided that railways were no longer an interesting experiment, but a matter of national survival, industrial development, military power, and imperial expansion, the pace changed dramatically. The slow beginning would eventually give way to railway boom, and that boom would reshape Russia. To understand why Russia's railway development appeared so slow, it was necessary to step back into the early 19th century before railways had become dominant. They had become a dominant form of long-distance land transportation. For centuries, Russia had heavily depended upon roads, rivers, canals, animal-powered transportation, and seasonal routes. Rivers were particularly important. During warmer months, they provided natural transportation corridors through enormous portions of the empire. During the winter, frozen waterways could become roads for sledges. Horses remained essential for transporting people and goods across land. The system was extensive, but it was slow and vulnerable to the geography and the weather. A journey may take hours by modern train. Could take days or weeks by horse. Moving large quantities of heavy goods over land was expensive. Agricultural products from the interior could be difficult to transport to markets. Industrial centers could struggle to obtain raw materials. Military movements across such large territory could make enormous amounts of time. The railway promised to change all of this. The basic idea was revolutionary because railroads dramatically reduced rolling resistance and a relatively small amount of locomotive power could move a large number of vehicles along prepared track. Instead of depending entirely upon horses, a railway could provide controlled transportation corridor in which trains could move with unprecedented regularity. The technology did not appear out from nowhere. Russia itself had earlier examples of rail-like transportation in mining regions. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, primitive railways were commonly used around mines in the Urals to move ore. In the 1830s, Russian engineers Efim and Miran Cherpanov developed a steam locomotive, the Taiga Works. Their locomotive was capable of transporting ore and people, demonstrating that steam-powered railway technology was not completely foreign to Russian engineers. However, they did not work immediately to lead a national railway industry. That distinction is important. Russia was not technologically incapable of building locomotives. It simply had not created the economic and political system necessary to turn isolated technological experiments into a national railway network. This was one of the central problems facing the Russian Empire. The locomotive could be built. The railway network was another matter entirely. In this section, we'll be starting with Britain. While Russian engineers were experimenting with steam power, Britain was already experiencing the beginnings of the railway industry. Britain had several advantages. It was geographically smaller than Russia. Its industrial revolution had already created enormous demand for transportation. Coal mines, ironworks, factories, ports, and growing cities created natural customers for the railway. A railway connecting two industrial centers could immediately serve a commercial purpose. Russia's geography was much different. A railway might have to take hundreds of kilometers before reaching the next major industrial center. The population was also distributed unevenly. Some regions were densely settled, while enormous areas contained relatively few people. The commercial case for a railway could therefore be much weaker. Imagine trying to convince investors to build hundreds of kilometers of tracks across territory where few towns, relatively little industry, and limited immediate passenger traffic. The railway might eventually transform the region, but who would pay for it before the transformation occurred? The question followed Russian railway development for decades. In Britain, railway companies could often point towards existing industrial demand. In Russia, the state frequently had to become the driving force behind railway construction. The difference could become one of the defining characteristics in the Russian railway story. The Russian government did not immediately respond to the arrival of the railway by ordering thousands of kilometers of track. There were legitimate reasons for caution. Building railways extremely expensive. Construction required iron rails, bridges, earthworks, stations, locomotives, rolling stock, skilled engineering, surveying teams, and enormous amounts of labor. In a country so large, the cost multiplied rapidly. There were so many concerns about the environment. Russia's winters were famously severe. Snow, ice, frozen ground, and extreme temperatures raised questions about whether railways could operate reliably throughout the year. There were economic concerns as well. Traditional transportation interests had something to lose. Owners of horse-drawn transportation and river transportation could see railways as competitors. The government's own officials debated whether certain railway projects would make economic sense. According to historical material published by the Russian Railways and TASS, opposition to be proposed St. Petersburg-Moscow Railway included arguments that the construction would be too expensive and that winter conditions would make operation difficult. There were also political concerns. A railway did more than transport cargo. It transported people. People carried ideas. A railway could bring workers into cities, allowing merchants to travel farther, move newspapers, and books rapidly, making communication between distant regions easier. But the autocratic government and social consequences of massive transportation could not be simply ignored. The railways could strengthen the state, but it could also accelerate social change. The tension would remain throughout history of Imperial Russian railways. Eventually, the government committed to a project that would change everything. The idea was simple: connect St. Petersburg and Moscow. The two cities were among the most important centers in Russian Empire. St. Petersburg was the imperial capital, while Moscow was the historic center of Russian political, cultural, and commercial life. A railway connecting them could demonstrate that railways could serve as serious national purpose.